Connecticut's local property taxpayers are too often stuck with paying for the rising cost of local government that result in large part from the inadequate state aid and the increasing cost and burden of state mandates. That's where CCM's Public Policy and Advocacy team comes in, battling to protect state aid for local public education and other critical town hall services, while working to prevent the burden of unfunded state mandates from falling unfairly on the shoulders of property taxpayers. Here today to discuss how these efforts went in the 2023 Connecticut General Assembly's regular session is CCM's Director of Public Policy and Advocacy, Brian O'Connor, along with Advocacy Manager, Randy Collins. We'd like to thank our sponsors at Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders. Brian, Randy, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Good to have you as always. So I know last time I think we had you on the show, Brian, was the beginning of session, and we just finished the long regular session where the state has to adopt a 2-year budget and pass a lot of legislation. And also, I remember, on that day coming back, this was the first kind of full regular session, kind of getting past COVID. The mask restrictions were lifted, the Capitol was open. Did it feel a little bit like kind of a return to normal, or get back to business as usual, or is it never going to be quite the same?
I was going to say certain aspects were definitely back to normal as far as just having people in the building.
Mm-hmm.
But certain things still kind of, lingering from the pandemic where there was restricted areas where you had to go behind some of the ropes, but also just the public hearing testimonies where a lot of people did it online. And, a lot of the members, individual General Assembly members, voted from, their office or what have you. So some of the access issues are still in play, and it's something that hopefully can be remedied in the next year or two.
Great. Well, obviously, there's a whole lot of stuff going on, so let's kind of dive right into it. And let's start off with the review of the adopted budget and see how our member towns and cities were impacted. So an issue that received a lot of attention from CCM this session and a significant investment from the legislature was local education. What are some of the details regarding education aid in the budget?
Well, we'll start off with just kind of a general overview, and then I'll have Brian kind of go into a little bit more about that education piece, which was certainly a significant win for our towns and cities. The legislature did adopt a 2-year biennium budget. It's about $50 billion. And I think most of the budget debate was framed at the beginning of this session. They extended for 5 years a number of fiscal guardrails that they put in place in 2017 with a bipartisan budget agreement that has really put the state in a strong fiscal position where in the years up to that, it had been, how many $1 billion are we short? And it wasn't, where are we going to gain? But okay, let's hope we don't lose too badly across the board. So they reaffirmed those fiscal guidelines, and that really shaped the debate because, quite honestly, they had more money than they could spend with those guardrails in place.
That was what we call like a rainy day fund?
Our rainy day fund, they actually they increased the rainy day fund to 18%. So we're at that cap. Our rainy day fund is filled to the statutory max.
We did that editorial cartoon kind of on this topic of, the kids with the school falling apart, and is it raining yet? I guess was the question. Yeah.
But they had reaffirmed bipartisan, on a bipartisan measure with the governor to maintain those fiscal guardrails and retain some of the controls, because in the past we had seen this kind of boom and bust cycle where we had nothing, and then all of a sudden we had a ton of money and they'd spend a ton, and then it provided a lot of inconsistency and a lot of, I think, long-term planning wasn't there. And I think we saw on the economic side a lot of companies where it made it harder for them to plan and long-term economic development on the private sector when they didn't know what was going on. So, with that background, as I said, that really shaped the debate. And even against that background, I think it really stands out to how well our towns and cities did. So we did adopt a $50.1 billion 2-year budget. And it was bipartisan. It's the first bipartisan budget since 2017.
Okay.
and very much overwhelming bipartisan support. A few Republicans voted no in the House. One Republican senator voted no when it went through the Senate. But some of the highlights of that budget, that we're really looking at, as you mentioned, we had an additional $150 million in what they're referring to education finance, which, as Brian will go into. In addition to that, we have an additional $135 million, which was put towards phasing in ECS. We have almost $19 million to hold harmless towns that were actually scheduled to see a decrease of education aid. We got an increase in pilot, which is a pilot reimbursement, which is payment in lieu of taxes. So money that comes back for statutorily tax exempt property. That was increased by each of the 3 tiers that are reimbursed. We'll see an additional 3% in the reimbursement that they receive, which is about $23 million. As I said, we saw additional money in some of the other aid, as I said, some of the other areas, more money in excess cost, received additional money in, local capital improvement or LOCIP. And by and large, as I said, when you looked at where some of the other advocacy groups, what they were looking for and the numbers that they got, it really stood out in stark contrast, the level of municipal support that we saw. But as I said, that $150 million in an education finance reform was certainly a focus, a main priority for our members and throughout the session. And I think, Brian, if you want to go into a little bit of how that's going to play out.
Yeah, give us a little bit of the details there, Brian.
Yeah, certainly. I think Randy framed it well. I think we did very, very well, financially in this budget. And I think, the lead horse here was education aid. There's an additional $68 million for ECS. There's also
the educational cost sharing program.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. The acronym
for the people at home.
The education cost sharing grant. And I think what this does is it accelerates full funding of ECS. And we're not quite there yet, but at the same time, it was definitely progress made for the towns that have been underfunded. I think a key provision of this as well is that those who were scheduled to see a decrease in their education aid were actually held harmless. So no one saw a reduction in their education aid. And there are some other policy reforms within this that I think are important to know, is that currently, let's say the town of Hamden sends a student to New Haven. New Haven's able to bill them for that student. It's called, for the tuition. What they've done is they've capped that in future years, 2025. So towns will not be losing money if they send a student out of district to another town, or as much money, I should say. And I think that's an important policy choice. It also incentivizes open choice. This is where students from inner cities go to a suburban school. They put more of a premium on it so that the suburban schools will be incentivized to take more students. And I think this goes to the goal of diversity within our educational system.
Yeah. I mean, that goes way back and all the way to like the chef decisions and stuff, right?
Yes, it's actually the open choice program is part of the chef decision.
Some other highlights regarding municipal aid in the budget. Randy mentioned this before, but pilot, which is the payment in lieu of taxes, which helps out, towns when they have stuff that's off the rolls, like state property, universities, hospitals, that kind of stuff. There was an increase of 3%. What does that mean to the communities that are, affected that really rely on that in some regard?
So this is, I think, continuing work that we had begun in I want to say 2019, I think was the last time we saw, where we had a significant increase in pilot. It's just been historically underfunded, which had really put it, especially some of our urban areas, cities like New Haven, New London, among others, Hartford, almost 50% of their taxable property is off the rolls. And by doing that, it doesn't reduce the cost of our towns and cities doing business, but it just shifts more of that burden onto residential taxpayers and non-exempt commercial taxpayers. So it really makes housing unaffordable. It makes an economic development. It's really, the property tax is highly regressive, and with the promise, what had always been that we'll give you 70% of what you should have been able to tax had it been on the rolls. And now we're getting, as I said, now we're going to start to see we're getting, for those tier 1 municipalities, which is a very complex formula I won't go into right now, but like New Haven, they're now getting 53% of that, whatever was promised. So we're not there, but we're starting to make progress. And I think, it would have been irresponsible. We knew that we couldn't go out and say, well, it's easy to say fully fund pilot, give us everything we deserve. But we also needed a formula, and it has to be, again, within those fiscal guardrails, and it also has to be something sustainable. So we got a giant lump sum, and then in a year or two, we have a budget hit. Towns are going to be right back to where they are. So one of the main things that we saw, Speaker Ritter, he spoke with our membership at the beginning of the year, like, the steps that we take have to be, measured and sustainable, which can protect us from those swings. And as I said, I think that's why we're going to see that 3%. And it's an addition, and it's an area where we can continue to work towards to get that full funding. And then hopefully, once we get there, we can start talking about revenue diversification and looking about how do we move away from that regressive property tax, which is such a hindrance of, as I said, housing, economic development, any number of issues that we have to address.
Yeah. And, we understand, the realities on the ground and when we're pushing for some of these things, but when we're talking about something being underfunded, we're not asking for more money than was originally promised. We're actually just asking for what was promised originally, right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And I think it's important to note that, for our listeners out there, is that municipalities really only have one source of income, and that's the property tax. And I think by taking the properties off the tax rolls, the pilot program is trying to recognize that, that it is our only sole source. So when you have, a city of New Haven that has over 50% of its property off the tax rolls, this helps them manage their budgets and helps alleviate some of those burdens of having property off the tax rolls. And I think I just want to highlight one of the things that CCM has done over the last couple of years is some of our social media advocacy, press conferences, engaging different stakeholders. I think where they bore fruit was basically with the education aid, with pilot. I think a lot of that is just being, pointing out these discrepancies in municipal aid and funding that where the shortfalls were, and how necessary it is to fully fund education, and if we can, fully fund or move toward the goal of fully funding pilot.
Yeah, I think it's important because so many of those pilot properties that we talk about, aren't just for that town either. We're talking about hospitals and things like that. They benefit the entire areas. Another part of the budget that we wanted to talk about was the act concerning Mashantucket, Pequot, and Mohegan Fund, which was passed late in the session. Can you talk about some of the revised language? It was put out there by Senator Kathy Austin, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what was involved with it?
So for years, when the state made their agreement with, originally it was Mashantucket Pequots to open the Foxwoods Casino. Part of the deal was that we would provide the tribal nations with exclusive gaming rights. In exchange, the state gets a portion, I think about 20%, don't quote me on that, of all the slot revenue that comes in. And of that money, they devised a formula that would then be redistributed to towns. And there's a different formula for kind of host or regionally impacted towns. And then that remainder of that money is spread out. Over the years, we've had, again, we talked about those budget crises before, that money had just been whittled down. I think it had been up to about 150 million at one point. It got down to below 40 million. And right now, it's slowly come back to 59 million. So what Senator Kathy Austin has pushed for about the last 2-3 years was to redirect that revenue towards its original goal. And especially in light of, as I said earlier, 18% state budget reserve. Why are we still sweeping those Mashantucket Pequot funds into an already statutory capped reserve fund? Our municipalities could use that. So what this bill does, starts in fiscal year, so it's starting in FY26. So it's not this budget biennium, but the next one. It increases the amount of money that's going to municipalities from the fund by almost just under $90 million. So it'll take it back up to almost its high. I think it'll go to 139 million annually that's distributed. But I think what's more important, because it's easy to put money in and then it comes right back out the first time we hit a budget crunch. She put in language that we worked for, that will require a 2/3 vote of each chamber.
It'll be hard to undo that.
So it really put some handcuffs on taking that money back. So it's going to be much more dependable and predictable for municipalities to bank on it. And again, that money is always going to fluctuate a little bit depending on the revenue stream, that slot revenue that comes in from casinos. I mean, it had dipped a little bit during COVID. Obviously, not many people were pulling levers, but it really was for a long-term, as I said, it's 2 years out before we'll see that, but really a solid step in the right direction. And I can't, express, the gratitude from CCM and our member towns and cities to Senator Austin and the work that she did in pushing that through. And that was really a nice win for everybody at the end of the session.
Yeah, it's going to be great for our members. You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM. So it sounds like we did pretty good in a lot of areas, but any session, there's going to be some disappointments. Are there any areas where we didn't fare as well? I know the early voting funding, I think we were hoping for more.
Yeah, they did pass early voting this year. We had the constitutional question last year, which, passed overwhelmingly. That changed our state constitution to allow for early voting. So, talking with our members this year, it wasn't do we like it or not? It was, we're getting early voting. And so we worked with the Secretary of State's office, members of the GAE committee. And while we were really pushing for a 10-day early voting period, they ended up going with 14 days.
Okay.
Best fiscal estimates were that it was going to cost around $5 million to do this, because you're going to have 4 days of early voting for presidential primary. I believe it's 5 days for regular primaries, and then 14 days of early voting for a general election. Obviously, these need to be staffed. There's materials, there's fiscal requirements. So we anticipated with the Secretary of State and ROVAC, which is the Registrars of Voters Association, all the registrars of voters, about a $5 million annual cost to do this. And as I said, we looked at about $1.8 million is what was put into the budget. The way we're looking at it, though, is this will get us through the presidential primary.
Okay.
And they will have to make budget adjustments next year. They always adjust that biennium budget, to make changes. And we're going to have to go back. We've already begun conversations with leadership that once we have better numbers and actual experience of doing the early voting, to go back and make sure that we do get adequate funding. And yes, it's a responsibility of municipalities to administer elections, but the state also has a responsibility. And I think that is recognized, and that's something that certainly will be a priority to address next session.
Yeah. Brian, do you have any thoughts on this either?
Yeah, I think it's very important, particularly for our municipalities to kind of determine what the true costs are. Next year, there is some talk that we may move up our primary, but right now it's scheduled for early April.
Okay.
And with a short session, the budget's going to be completed most likely in mid to late April. So it's going to be a quick turnaround time, but the numbers should be fresh as well, as far as what the true costs will be. And then we can extrapolate that out for a full presidential general election, as well as, General Assembly primaries. And, the Republicans will probably have the presidential primary will have been completed by then, but at the same time, it'll set us up for the presidential election and then the municipal election the year after.
So we know it's probably not going to be enough, but for right now, we're going to use that to kind of get through the next few, figure it out, and then reevaluate from there.
I was going to say, this is one of those situations where we're going to try to keep them to their word. They said that they would fully fund it, dollar for dollar. And, I have to say that Secretary of State Stephanie Thomas has been great leading this. She understands. She's a friend of municipalities, and I know she's going to be championing it as well as individual cities and towns.
Yeah, that's good to know. A little comforting. So besides some of these direct appropriations, towns and cities receive funds through state bonding programs. which help offset the cost of capital improvements, private economic development, things like that, or promote economic development. What are some of the bond authorizations municipal leaders count on that were approved in the budget?
So some of the ones, as I said, we have, your traditional, I think it's, what are we calling it now? Grants for municipal purposes, which it's about $91 million. They renamed it. It used to be grants for municipal projects. Now it's grants for municipal purposes. And it had filled a budget hole that had been created a few years back. That remains at $91 million. We did see increases over the last few years. We did see, as I said, additional money in LoCIP, which is local capital improvement, money for local capital improvement projects. That increased by $15 million. So we'll now see $45 million in each of the authorized $45 million each of the 2 years of the biennium. They funded the STEEP, which is Small Town Economic Assistance Program, which did not have money originally in the governor's budget, did not have money for this first fiscal year, but had, was going to be funded the second year. The legislature saw to allocate money for that Small Town Economic Assistance Program. We did see an additional $10 million annually for brownfield remediation and redevelopment, which is really key for a lot of our old factory towns, where a lot of these, you go to almost any town, you can see these old factories that are kind of abandoned, broken windows, boarded windows. A lot of them have significant contaminants within it. So how do you bring these projects? So we've created some pretty strong, almost best in the nation brownfield remediation programs to help developers come in, offset the cost. And these programs, as I said, have been funded at $25 million annually. It is oversubscribed. That's how popular and how well these programs are run. So to see an additional, $10 million will go a long way to getting these, as I said, these abandoned sites, which really are, they're danger. Homeless, will use it. They're fire hazards, these old factories. But to get them cleaned up, turned around, and a lot of them have, there's requirements they're looking for mixed use development when they can. So you have some shop apartment style. But all of a sudden you'll see one of these projects come on, and you take this boarded up abandoned building, and now you make it something that's working. The whole neighborhood now will start to see a rise as, that doesn't have that ugly anchor in the middle. So really, to increase the funding is an acknowledgement. I think the number is roughly, for every dollar that the state invests, they're looking at about, I think it's almost a $15 to $20 return on that investment. So really strong programs that our municipalities have taken advantage of. And as I said, how do we, rather than having that company move out and plow under, undeveloped land, how do we get this blighted, abandoned property now put back onto the tax rolls, and not only bringing in taxes, but raising the property values for the businesses around. So really a good win there. So other than that, as I said, I think our bonding allocations were very much on line of where we were. There's money for PFAS in there. If you look through the whole package, it's fairly robust, but we saw money for PFAS, money for police body cams. So a lot of those little programs, the $5 and $10 million there, the $3 million for PFAS removal, as I said. So again,
PFAS, that's the chemical in the fire extinguisher things.
That was and so a lot of the equipment that firefighters have used it's very hard once you've used it, really used to put out like gasoline fires, oil fires, but it stays in that equipment, and it has found to be a carcinogen. So, but it's onerous to either have to clean that, remove it, and get that out, or replace. So, having the state acknowledge that, hey, this was, through no fault of anybody's, but we need to do it. Provide some assistance to help, our towns as they move forward with existing equipment. Obviously, as you turn over into new equipment, it's not there, but one of the other ones, we didn't get money for it, but I did want to mention, we did expand the use of LoCIP. This is really important for our Eastern Connecticut towns. Now you can use existing LoCIP funds for the removal of dead or dying trees. Because we've had significant problems with the emerald ash borer. So you're seeing large swaths of trees that you need, not only do you need to cut down because of the safety hazard they produce, but you can't just get rid of the wood because it's contaminated. So there's a whole process by which that wood needs to be removed. So while we couldn't get set aside money for that, at least allowing this existing state funds to be used for that will be a benefit to our town as they try to grapple with this problem.
Yeah, especially every time we have a storm, the trees fall down and we all lose electricity. That seems like a good use of things. Brian, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add, there was one other significant policy changes regarding LoSiP, is that now the money will be allocated up front. You don't have to apply and seek reimbursement. You can have the money sent directly to the town when it's available. So this way they can better plan, and they still have to do the paperwork to provide evidence of the project that they're doing, but at least it cuts out some of the bureaucracy of having to send the paperwork into the state first before getting the money.
Yeah. One of the perennial kind of issues that municipalities face is try to find a sustainable solution for is the issue of firefighters who contract cancer. I know CCM has been negotiating with firefighters for years about providing good benefits to them. What were you able to come up with as a resolution? What was the compromise this year?
Yeah, I was going to say this issue has been a perennial one, for lack of a better term, since 2015. Municipalities and firefighters have been negotiating in good faith to try to find enough resources to cover the benefits of a firefighter who contracted cancer, and at the same time find a sustainable revenue source. And I think one of the things that we were able to accomplish this year is one of our main concerns was putting it into workers' comp as a rebuttable presumption. Right now, you can actually file for a workers' comp claim as a workplace injury if you were to contract cancer. But there's some issues with that we tried to remedy with what we put forward. And as part of the compromise, what we've done is we basically mirrored the workers' comp system. But there's a statewide fund that will fund those benefit levels. They also include spousal benefits besides just wage replacement. And the state allocated $5 million for that fund this year. The onus is on us and the firefighters to find a more sustainable revenue stream in the future years, because I think trying to rely on a direct appropriation year in and year out would prove difficult. And also we just kind of want to make sure that it has enough resources so that we can provide the benefits and keep it ultimately out of workers' comp.
Yeah. And that's the Firefighters Cancer Relief Fund that you're talking about from 2016?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And I think some of the other components, I think July 1 of this year, this is from a bill that passed last year, actually, we're going to get a report that basically speaks to the turnout gear, how many, what's the appropriate number. Many towns already do provide 2 sets of turnout gear. That will be important. And speaking of PFAS, some of the older turnout gear had PFAS. That's kind of a fire retardant. So again, you kind of link, maybe that PFAS exposure to the cancer presumption. So that is one thing. And the other part of it is there's special washing machine extraction equipment. Where you actually put the turnout gear in, and we're looking at that'll be part of the report as well, how to best approach that. And I think it could be a regional approach for some of our smaller towns, but we want to make sure that people aren't sitting around in the gear. Those days of kind of taking pride in having just fought a fire and keeping the equipment on, we want to take it off, wash it, clean it, and make sure that the exposure is limited.
Yeah, because that equipment, while they're in the middle of fire, can get fumes, chemicals on it, and that's what they want that special washer wash off. It's not just my stinky shirt. There could be chemicals on those that they have to take care of.
Correct. Yeah. The idea is they would extract all the the bad stuff,
the bad
off
stuff.
The and clean up the gear so the next time there is a fire that you're wearing fresh gear.
Yeah. And I think, man, I just want to say, I know Brian and some of the other members of our team, the amount of work and with a key group, kind of a key working group of our membership, the effort that they put into this, as Brian had said, I think he might have still, I think he was still, on the inside before he joined us at CCM. This was one of the most hard fought issues and very personal issues that we had to deal with. And I think it shows how, how CCM continues to kind of, from the old days, we just said no to everything. And that was just kind of the line. We just said no to, like, hey, let's reach across. Let's see if we can find common ground. And when that other side, when the firefighters said, hey, let's sit down, and we were willing to talk. And Michelle Cook, the state rep from Torrington, really started this process of, and over the years, I think we've all given something, not gotten, everybody's given something that they wanted. Hasn't gotten everything that they wanted, but it's shown a willingness to work across the lines to develop, to come together to say, hey, how do we move forward rather than just say no and and see who can out muscle. And as I said, when you turn on the national news and you just see this, the partisan rancor, especially at the national level, I think, it's a truly an example of, let's sit down, let's find a common ground. I don't think we'd ever disagreed on the principle, but it was how to get there. And I said, once we kind of got past that, and as I said, we've been able to negotiate in good faith. And when we come together, it is a very strong coalition for, when our mayors and our first selectmen, working with our firefighters or our police on other issues, we can be an extremely strong voice and pushing an agenda forward rather than just saying no.
Yeah.
And when we take these and we're not fighting, we can push for more money for pilot or vegan Pequot. So it's, it serves a benefit across the board.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM. What are some other key issues that CCM was concerned with during this session? I know one of them was the tire dumping. I know was one we were talking about. You want to talk about that a little bit?
How long
about tires?
It
was quite a bit. And actually, before we speak to the tires, I just want to say that CCM had 14 policy goals this year as part of our legislative agenda, and we were able to accomplish 8 of them, and which was a very successful year. And one of the top bills that we had this year was what they call extended producer responsibility, EPR, for tires. And I think one of the things is the cost of recycling the tires and through that process. So now we created a system that's very much in line with what you do with mattresses. There's an upfront fee that helps alleviate the cost, and also the paint program that we've implemented at the municipal level as well, which has been very successful. And we hope to replicate that with tires. And I think one of the things is with the illegal dumping, it costs so much money. Let's say there, however many tires, it's the town's responsibility at that point for the public works department to pick them up, and they don't get compensated for that, for the cost of removing the tires and getting them out of the waste stream. With the highly publicized tire dumping, it was very fortuitous that it occurred when the bill appeared that it was going to die, actually. And we got kudos from Speaker Matt Ritter, who basically acknowledged that CCM's pushed helped get it back on the agenda and ultimately passed.
That's great.
I mean, and beyond just the illegal tire dumping, we saw, I think it was in Trumbull, we saw a truck. It must have been a truckload just into a wooded area. But you go around our cities and you'll just see tires on the side of the road. And again, so you see the big examples, but it's also that pervasive problem. And now if people know I have a place where I can take it when I get that new tire, it makes it, less likely, as I said, to see that illegal dumping. So besides, again, it's just another good win for our municipalities in terms of there's funding and, hopefully a better process that residents will take advantage of.
Yeah, if it's easier and cheaper to do the right way from the start, you'll get less of that illegal dumping, which ends up costing more than if you'd done it right in the first place. Were there any changes to the motor vehicle assessments this year?
So last year, when they passed the biennium or the mid-year budget adjustments, they changed the way which municipalities would assess and then tax motor vehicles.
Okay.
Well, everyone agrees no one likes a car tax. It's a $1 billion revenue stream, and until we figure out an alternative, that we're not getting rid of it. But they were going to change, because I think one of the problems we saw during COVID was all of a sudden, typically you think, oh, I drive off the lot, my vehicle value drops 20%. And all of a sudden you saw used car vehicles were skyrocketing. And your vehicle, your 10-year-old Honda, was worth more today than it was 5 years ago, because there was just such shortage. And it really threw a lot of people's tax bills, really made it harder for residents to anticipate what that bill was going to be. So what they wanted to do was move to a manufactured suggested retail price with a depreciation scale that would obviously it would be 90% off the lot, then 80, then 85, then 90, and as at 8 or whatever, and so on and so forth until a minimum value is reached. There were significant technical problems with the language that had originally been passed, because it had been done very quickly. So it was not going to be we were not in a position where we were going to be able to institute the law. So early on, we recognized we needed to either delay, or basically we needed to amend the law, and then we also needed to delay it for a year. And we worked throughout the session with OPM, with legislative leaders, with our municipal partners, the assessors, the tax collectors. We finally reached agreement on how to change the language with the right delays so that we could move forward. Unfortunately, at the end, there were some disagreements within the Senate, within some of the senators. So we have a 1-year delay on the bill. So there's going to be no changes. So we will be able to tax and collect motor vehicles, tax and send our bills out this fall. So it's going to be an issue that we're going to have to come back at and reassess and redo again next year. It's a little frustrating that come to a final solution for the issue, but at least we put our municipalities in a position where we're not going to be detrimentally impacted this fall, which was, I think, your overriding concern going forward.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the issues here is that with the values of the used cars going up, is in some ways it was impacting some people who maybe were the least able to deal with that increase. Lower income people who have a used car that's not worth that much, but may have doubled in value just because everyone else needs an affordable little car.
Yeah, and where Governor Lamont had capped motor vehicle mill rates and provided reimbursement, I think they realized that wasn't going to give as much relief as they had hoped for on the individual level. So this was kind of the bookend. They were looking at this as the bookend piece to helping on the motor vehicle side. But again, it's going to be a few years off, just because again it's a really complex set of issues in terms of assessment, value, billing dates, and how that all worked. As I said, I know some assessors, and I really have to tell them when I ask, can you help me understand what this language is? And I said, I need it brief. Because it is like reading stereo instructions at times.
Very complicated stuff. Another complicated issue always is housing reform. Was there any kind of movement on that this year?
There was a little bit of movement, and actually, let me back up a little bit. This was actually one of the more contentious issues up at the Capitol this year. And the original proposal, they called the fair share allocation. That actually was going to be probably one of the most costly unfunded mandates that municipalities had faced in recent memory. And part of the reason why is because it would allow developers and other nonprofit groups to have standing in order to sue municipalities to force them to build affordable housing. So eventually that moved a little bit, where it just became the developer would be able to have standing. And I think one of our major concerns at that point is that they didn't actually have to be denied in order to sue a municipality to accept a project. We were successful in removing that provision, but what moved forward is that OPM has been directed by the legislature to see what that fair share allocation should be, what each town in theory should develop as far as affordable housing. And I think what's important about this is that now we'll see the extent to what some of the goals are of the fair share allocations that towns are going to be expected to move forward on as far as developing affordable housing. Now, we do have input on that. I think, I'm going to give kudos to my colleague Donna Hamsey, who made sure that municipal representation would at least be consulted as far as the methodology that they have to come up with. And I think that's an important provision, because the way it was originally structured, we were not part of that process. So now that we're part of the process, I think, we feel more comfortable in working with, in this case, OPM, but also Majority Leader Jason Rojas, who this is one of his main legislative priorities. And we understand that, he'd like to move forward on some level, but at least now we can take a deep breath, participate in the process, and then from there determine what's the best course of action and moving forward. I think everyone sort of agrees that affordable housing is a key issue, but you also have to recognize some of the market forces that are in play that are hindering building affordable housing, either at the market rate or subsidy.
So another one I know that came up in this session was pedestrian safety, more specifically what we call red light cameras.
So this has been about on and off for about 10 years. CCM has looked at this issue of how do we improve not even just pedestrian safety, but just, roadway safety, because obviously it impacts drivers. But as we're making a stronger push towards, non-motor vehicle transit, bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, walkways, we're really starting to see it, a significant increase in pedestrian fatalities. In West Hartford, where I live, we saw 5 pedestrian fatalities in about a 6-month period. And I think this is being played out throughout the state. Really, this effort was truly led by Representative Roland Lamar from New Haven. And, when I say like the level of work that he put into creating another tool for municipalities to install, they're referred to automated enforcement devices, but it can be a combination of red light cameras or speed cameras.
Okay.
But it's also going to be one of those, it's just not carte blanche. You're not going to see them on every intersection. DOT has to come up with guidance that are going to take into, a number of factors, history of accidents at said intersection or traffic citations. The looking at dispersing them so it doesn't disproportionately impact certain areas of a city. So once DOT develops their guidelines, municipalities will have to develop a plan that they can roll these out at a local option and in designated areas. So pedestrian safety zones that are designated, or like school zones. And we just looked at this. This is the big myth we want to dispel. It's not a municipal revenue grab, that this is not something, fees are capped. I think it's $50 for the first one and $75 for subsequent violations. But this is how do we promote pedestrian safety? And I think we can all say after COVID, I don't know, people forgot how to drive, but it is dangerous out there. And how do we come about? And I think Greg Howard, Republican from Stonington, said this might not be the perfect bill, but we've got to try something. So really kudos to the labor that, as I said, Roland Lamar put into this in providing this option for some municipalities. And I think you'll see our urban areas and some ring suburbs be the first to do it. And I think our other towns will kind of look and see how it rolls out. And then even once you do a plan, it has to be renewed every few years based on the data to see how it's working. So again, it's not how do we improve safety, but we don't want to target. We don't want to just put these on every intersection to catch that roll. I'm 2 miles an hour over the speed limit. We want to just catch the pervasive, the people that are just not paying attention and really posing a risk for everybody out there.
Yeah, it's not some sort of mass surveillance state thing. It's people on their phones not paying attention at busy intersections is one of the real issues.
And that's what we're hoping for. I keep trying to convince my wife because she's on the other side of this one.
She's on the anti-camera side. There's one in every house. Another issue that's obviously near and dear to our hearts is the Connecticut Municipal Employees Retirement System, or CMERS. And there's modifications to this that address the sustainability of it and anticipated saving Connecticut taxpayers almost $30 million this year and $843 over the next 30. Can you talk about CMERS?
Certainly. I think, this is, again, I just want to acknowledge the tireless effort of Comptroller Sean Scanlon, who put a working group together starting in March, and they met basically over the next 2 months to come up with a plan to help alleviate some of the costs of SEMERS. SEMERS is a great retirement plan, but the way it's structured, it's in state statute, and the financial burden is mostly borne by municipalities. And with the investments not producing the returns that they had historically, but also the number of retirees and a whole bunch of other factors, towns were spending an inordinate amount to help fully fund the SEMERS program, and it was becoming unsustainable. And recognizing that, as I said, Comptroller Scanlon put a work group together, and they came up with a plan basically to re-amortize the fund debt from 17 years to 25 years. That's the provision that's going to give the immediate relief of the $30 million. The other $840 million that you mentioned will come about over the next 30 years because of some of the changes to the COLA. Right now, the way the COLA is set up is an automatic 2%. You could have an inflationary environment that prior to this that was at 1% or what have you, but the COLA you'd have to pay out 2%. So this will gradually reduce that 0.5 of 1% each year until it gets to zero. So we're lowering the floor, and that's going to produce significant savings. We also, just to point out, we raised the cap. Right now it's capped at 6%, basically 2% to 6%. Again, in this inflationary environment, the retiree would actually be able to capture, I think it's right now at like 6.3% inflationary rate. We went up to 7.5. So in these high inflationary environments, they'll be able to keep up with those costs. The other thing too is they instituted a drop plan, and what this is a deferred retirement option plan. This is actually to incentivize employees to stay. So they pay into a fund and they get a lump sum after 5 years upon their retirement. It's an incentive to keep people working longer, which is, you want more people paying into the system in order to, subsidize those who are retired, kind of like Social Security in that respect. Other two important provisions that I just want to point out is it did reform the governance structure. So municipalities will have a greater voice and input as far as what the plan should provide, and as they contemplate, some of the changes and some of the contribution rates. The other part of that is that there's going to be data collection. This data collection is actually for non-SEMERS towns. See what retirement plans those towns are providing, and just to provide some data on that and see what best practices they may want to recommend in the future. And I think the important part of this too is that there's a commitment of that working group to meet in the interim between now and next session to see if there's an opportunity to come to an agreement on, for lack of a better term, a tier 2 SEMERS plan. And this would get into other factors as far as retirement age, years of service, and also contribution rates. So, we've been kicking the door on this for years. I know there's some reticence by some of our actually non-SEMERS towns who are concerned how they may be impacted by these changes. And they're going to have a seat at the table during the interim process as well, which I think is important. And for our SEMERS towns, they can budget better now. They'll be able to plan better, and it is more sustainable in the long term. I just want to thank, if I can thank two members on this, Steve Stefanow from Manchester and also Kurt Miller from Ansonia, who both were part of that working group and gave an inordinate amount of time on it. So they did a good job.
I think that, and this again is another example of, us being able to reach across, kind of reach across the divide. I don't, this wouldn't have happened without, a compromise with the representatives of the labor unions, and I really think we have to thank them for understanding that, again, it's not about, do we want to provide benefits or not, but, how can we do it in a fiscally responsible and sustainable way? And, their willingness, again, for everybody to kind of give a little bit to ensure that we, fiscal stability moving forward. is key, as opposed to us just trying to jam it down their throat and then saying no. When you sit down and you talk, you realize you probably have more in common. So it would not have been possible without Comptroller Scanlon bringing our side and the unions back together and saying, hey, we need a path forward. When you talk to your opponents, for lack of a better term, you can find there's more in common than there is opposed.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM. What were some onerous unfunded mandate things that were happening in this session?
I'll point out one. There was, solid waste reform. They closed. I can never remember what it actually stands for, but it's the Mirror plant up in Hartford was shut down, and I think
the trash burning plant.
Correct. Yeah, it was. Again, they needed serious commitment or investment in their existing facility, and the state made a decision not to invest those funds there and rather close it down and cap it. And I think part of the important part of that is that now our municipalities have to truck, those towns that were mirror towns have to truck their waste out of state.
Yeah.
So the state proposed putting a $5 fee without any real statewide plan. And so we fought that. We didn't think that was appropriate until they actually came up with a full funding plan to start charging towns for lack of foresight, really. There was other provisions of that would have mandated organic waste recycling at the residential level. And also, again, EPR, extended producer responsibility for packaging. Again, we were opposed pretty much member-wide on the $5 fee, and we were successful, even though I know the governor's office was very, very adamant that they wanted these funds just to demonstrate, for bonding purposes to help move us forward on potentially another trash to energy plant. But until one is cited, it's difficult for our membership to accept that. So we understand again that the state's in a difficult position, and again, we want to collaborate, but we didn't think that was the right approach. And as far as the organic composting, they did expand it for more commercial entities. It does include, depending on the volume of waste, have educational facilities. So this could capture some of our
school cafeterias and stuff like that.
Yeah, and a lot of towns are already doing this at the school district level. So that's something that I think is a good, again, way to start to move forward. I think at the residential level, again, we need the infrastructure be a little bit more built out in order for us to be able to accommodate that. And then the EPR, I think our membership, that's for packaging, I think our membership is open to that. And again, what does that look like? How does that work? I think this is one of those things, again, that leadership in both the House and Senate thought we came up short. So we know that this is coming back next year and working with them on hopefully a statewide solution.
Yeah. And was there some concern with the OSTA stuff this year?
Yeah, there was a bill that had been put forward by the Department of Transportation. In one sense, it's related to pedestrian safety, but the way that the bill was written, OSTA is the Office of State Traffic Authority. And they're the ones who kind of set all the rules and regulations for our roads, signs, lights, timing on lights. All of those are set in statute or in regulation. It's a big section of our general statutes. And the original bill would have said that if you have a violation, if you aren't following any of these just innumerable rules, that you would have lost your town aid road, which is a perennial $60 million bonding source for our municipality. Very important. So we pushed back on that. Well,
just any one of those tons and tons of rules. If you one of them, you could lose all your funding
potentially. And there wasn't a process, and that's why it was so onerous. I mean, you should have a double yellow line instead of a single yellow line. If you have a child at play sign, I mean, they're very nitpicky.
Yeah,
we know that wasn't the intent of DOT, but again, when you have to look at the law and say, but then if that's not your intent, then let's clean this up. And until we do, we can't support that. And so DOT was willing, we worked with the legislature, we talked to DOT repeatedly. They pulled back on this. This is something we'll look at and say, okay, how do we get compliance without opening our municipalities up to just, really nitpicky bureaucracy? And just some of the other ones, I figured, we're getting close to the end here. We started with property taxes. We can end with property taxes. The there are 100 mandated property tax exemptions, and every year there's a dozen, 2 dozen new property tax exemptions that are proposed, or they want to expand them. And some of these truly tug at your heartstrings, and they're tough. But, as a policy, we testify against every single property tax exemption and say until we address the overall system, it is not fair for the state to, provide a tax exemption for any particular group, and endear goodwill, and then literally hand the bill to pay for it to our towns and cities. So at times it's tough to testify against some of these bills because of the heartstrings that they pull at. But I don't, I'm sure there's something slipped in someplace, but I think we were largely successful in holding the line on new property tax exemptions and saying until we fix where we're at, stop, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And that's where we are. We're hope with the legislature, I think we were successful in at least we didn't dig further this year.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on any of that?
To add to that, I think what people don't recognize, the state's, doing very well financially. We're, our rainy day fund is full. But if you look at municipalities, there's a lot they're strained. And a lot of it is the inflationary costs that people don't put into account, like higher energy bills, increases in healthcare. And I think that's why we fight so hard to fully fund and try to fulfill the commitments that the legislature has made, both in education, but also our pilot programs. And until we get revenue diversification that expands beyond just the property tax, I think, that's the position that we have to hold. And we have to be vigilant because, individually, Randy just mentioned there was 100 different tax exemptions. Someone might say, well, this is a little one, doesn't cost that much. But when you add it up and now you have 101, 102, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And, it's very important that we educate General Assembly members and legislators on those true impacts in an aggregate and cumulative basis.
Great. So you guys are resting up now. You just finished one session, but I'm going to go ahead and ask about next session. What do you see as some of the issues that are going to be coming back next year, and how do you prioritize which ones as an organization we focus on?
We actually just had our legislative committee meeting this past Tuesday, and that's one of the things that we've already started. We've already looked at the 2024 session coming up. I think, some of the issues we spoke to today will be coming back: solid waste, affordable housing or housing reform will be two of the key issues. I think the other part of it is finding a reliable, sustainable funding source for the cancer presumption bill, firefighter cancer relief fund, rather. And I think those are some of the highlights. Now, how do we figure out what's important? Our members tell us. They reach out. We have our policy committee process, and that's another area where people bring up their different ideas. But usually we hear from our members saying, these are our thoughts on this individual bill or concept. And then we try to translate that into our advocacy.
That's great. Well, Brian, Randy, thanks for coming on today and giving us the lowdown on everything that happened in the Capitol this session, and keep up the good work.
All right. Hey, thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Have a good one.
We'd like to thank our sponsors at Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer. Christopher Gilson is our producer. Harry Draws is on the boards. And I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like. And watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.